Right. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Leadership, Finding Your Unique Style. We're going to begin in just a moment or so. I'm going to give it another minute or so for people to finish their last Zoom meetings and jump on and join this webinar. So we'll give it just a minute or so, and then we'll begin our session today. Okay, we'll get started. So welcome, everyone. It's delightful to have you with us on a Friday morning, at least here on the West Coast. I'm Dr. Stephen Goodwin. I'm president and CEO of Turning West. We're an organization development and leadership consulting firm with clients across all the sectors, from government to nonprofit, for-profit, and faith-based communities. Our specialty at Turning West is organizational culture, and we really are interested in how that leaders can influence and shape organizational culture and how that can make for a better world. Joining with me today is my colleague, Dr. Peggy Kendall. Peggy, you want to say a word about yourself?
Hi, I'm Peggy Kendall, and I've been with Turning West for a couple of years now. I also am a professor of communication studies at a university in Minnesota, where it is very, very cold right now. So my emphasis, I love talking about communication and how communication and leadership go together.
Great. It's going to be a great conversation today and a great topic for all of you joining us and those who will join us through the magic of YouTube videos to be broadcast later. So we welcome you as well if you can join us later on and not just this morning. So Peggy, let's dive in here and talk about leadership and how do leaders find their own unique style. So the first question we would have for everyone is, what do you think of when you hear the word leader? And hopefully maybe you have a pencil and a piece of paper nearby you and just jot down a couple of bullet points of some thoughts that first come to mind when you hear that word leader. What rings that bell immediately? So Peggy, what does it happen for you when you hear that word leader? What pops into mind first?
I think of people with a big desk in the big office with big windows, and when they talk, everybody listens. I guess that's what I think of when I think of leader.
That's common. That's probably the most common definition, especially in our Western democracy of television and internet personalities and all these other folks. Um, I think of leaders and followers. Who's following, and how does that intersection happen between the leader and follower? And I think about um, sometimes we define leader as someone who's got that big desk in the corner office or the CEO title on the top of their business card. But that's not always the case with what makes a leader. We're going to find that out as we wrestle with this today. Um, so you may have some pictures in your mind of people that may have come to mind on the next slide to show you kind of some that may come to mind for us. And you may think about leaders in different categories and different settings. Some of these you may not know. If you know Captain Kirk from the 1960s Star Trek, he was always portrayed as always knew what to do, always had the right answer, always was confident, never got scared or worried. But you might think of Mother Teresa in her leadership style: quiet, unassuming, not wealthy at all. She owned 2 saris and a bucket to wash them in. At her death was all she owned. But she made a profound influence in the world. In the far right-hand corner is someone you may not know from the business world, but this is Sara Blakely, who started the company Spanx. And she bootstrapped that thing from nothing, from her own bank account, into a billion-dollar enterprise. And now is a really inspiring leader for lots of people in the world, and especially women. Vladimir Zelensky, whether you like him or not, or think of his politics and so forth and what he's doing in the world as leader of the country of Ukraine. People think of him and look to him for leadership. And in the bottom middle, Peggy, is
I threw that one in when Steve wasn't looking. I
right.
think of Katniss Everdeen, because she was one tough woman and you did not get on her bad side because
That's right. Yep.
she was tough.
And she knew her boundaries and she knew what she stood for and she fought for it, right? And that's really
true.
admirable.
That's true.
Right? And in the far right corner, bottom right corner, is Muhammad Yunus. You may not recognize this Nobel Peace Prize winner who started the micro-lending movement. He developed the movement of lending small, tiny amounts of money to people to start businesses in third world countries. And he single-handedly has changed more lives than maybe anyone on this diagram, fictional or real, nonetheless. A really, truly an incredible business leader who started something remarkable. You might be thinking in your mind, and you might just jot down on your paper there, who came to mind for you? Is a person, is it a family member, could be a grandparent, a parent, someone who comes to mind who exemplifies leadership for you. And we want you to capture this and come back to this later on and reflect on, why did that image or that person come to mind for me? What was it about that person or that story that's told of Muhammad Yunus, for example, or even Katniss Everdeen, the fictional story, that I was drawn to, that she popped up in my definition of leadership? So that might be something to just capture and hold on to as we move on to kind of talk more about this. Peggy, you want to talk about what we're going to try to accomplish today?
So we're going to try and make this webinar a little bit different than some of our other ones. Hopefully this is a little more interactive. We've got a chat if you want to engage in the chat. But hopefully we can get you to start thinking about leadership. So we're going to give you a little bit of insight into sort of the history of leadership, how it's evolved. We're going to look at different sort of levers of influence, different things that impact leadership styles. But I think our biggest outcome that we're hoping for is to give you just a little bit of space to start thinking about your leadership style, to start writing down some of the answers to some of these questions that we have. We're going to talk about some of our answers to the questions, but hopefully you can take time to actually write down some of the things that come to mind.
Absolutely. And the reason this is so important, and the reason I'm so passionate about this particular topic, is that we all hear the word leadership all the time in our culture. Lots of books are written about them. I just finished a couple this week. And we all think we know, but then we have to start. When I ask a person, what's your definition of leadership? Rarely do I get a coherent answer, because they're like, well, I've never thought about that. And we believe that it's so absolutely important for you to think about this and come up with your own style and your own definition of leadership, so that you can talk about this. And the more you can identify and quantify this, the more you can live into this.
Well,
so,
and let me ask
please.
you this, Steve. So why do you think having a definition of leadership is important? I mean, what does that give you?
So I've read probably 800 or 900 books on leadership, did my doctorate in the field, have a ton of them behind me here, literally. And every single one has a different definition. There are so many different facets of leadership and so many different ways of looking at it. It's like looking at your diamond on your hand, for example. You look at it and the light shines this way and refracts this way on the other side of another facet. There's so many different aspects to look at in leadership, which makes it so difficult to say there's one right definition. There isn't. So it's important for each of us to find out, how would I define it as an expression of my unique style?
Yeah.
How do I do leadership that's different from everybody else?
Yeah.
Here's a few that I really like from the books that I've read over the years, by Kouzes and Posner, called The Leadership Challenge. And these two authors have sold millions of copies of the book, The Leadership Challenge, which I highly recommend, by the way, as one of the seminal books on leadership. But they define leadership this way: the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. So Peggy, as you hear that, what do you like about that definition? What jumps out at you when you hear that definition?
Well, I guess a lot of times I don't think about mobilizing others. I think about managing others,
Ah, yes.
telling them what to do, maybe. So this idea of mobilizing others, it I think it feeds a little bit more into this idea of empowering others to be the best version of themselves.
Yeah, I love that verb mobilizing because it's not that I'm telling, it's not that I'm compelling, it's not that I'm ordering. The idea sort of there is I'm somehow using some tools to gather and to pull people together naturally by their own devices and their own motivation to come together to want to struggle for shared aspirations. I really love that verb there a lot. I also like the word art in there because
Oh,
it isn't
wow.
art to lead. There's no one right quantifiable way to lead, which we'll see in a minute when we talk about the history of leadership.
Yeah. And I do think one of the values of like looking at definitions is I think it's really easy to think either I am a leader or I'm not a leader. But I'm not sure that's the case. And that gets back into how we're actually defining this term, because in many ways we're all leaders. And I think if we can get a clearer vision for what that term means, I think we can start to internalize some of the real assets that we have.
Right, absolutely. The next one comes from one of the classic books on leadership, literally called On Leadership by John Gardner. It's really another one worth adding to your leadership library. And he defines leadership as this: the process of persuasion or example by which an individual or leadership team induces a group of people to pursue objectives held by the leader or shared by the leader and his or her followers. This is an older definition and may have some troubles here, but what do you see in this, Peggy, that you like or dislike, as the case may be?
Well, as a communication person, of course, I'm going to jump on the word persuasion because there's so much research, going all the way back to Aristotle of what is persuasion. And there's just so many different strategies, and whether it's telling, like you said before, telling or managing, or being someone's friend, or using your relational influence, or lots of different kinds of strategies. So this one feels a little more strategic.
Yes. And I jump on the word the process. It's a process, right? So many times I hear leaders say, well, I sent out an email. And I go, well, it's more than that, right? You can't just tell and then expect. Even the military, the American military has some of the best leadership experiences and training of the world round, and they've studied leadership for generations now. And they've learned that it is a process of persuasion and example, right? Being an example yourself. It's not just I'm giving a command and that's leadership. There's more to it than that. And I love this definition by John Gardner. It's really helpful. Another one we might share with you is from Max De Pree, from Herman Miller. And this one's really unique. The first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between the two, the leader must become servant and a debtor. What strikes you about that definition, Peggy?
First of all, it strikes me that I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about, but so defining reality. So maybe that is this persuasive strategy where you help people reframe circumstances
Yes.
to feel more empowered and to be better aligned with the goals that you set in front of them.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, that's exactly what he means, in that you can't just be a visionary and say, I want us to go here. You've got to define we are here to start with. And that's where the leader says, times are great, or we're in a pickle, or we've got a challenge that we need to focus on this, we need to solve. That's what he means by this first responsibility of a leader, is to define what's the task in front of us, our reality. And I love the thank you piece, because good leaders understand that they shouldn't take all the credit. They can't take all the credit, not really. It's a group effort. The leader is playing their part, his or her part. But really, that last clause there, they must become a servant and a debtor. They're indebted to the people who are following them because they did a lot of the work and often offered insights, ideas, challenges that were invaluable. And so they're also a servant to those followers as well. I love that category of his, that kind of servant leadership mentality that's so powerful.
Yeah, and to add debtor in there, in addition to servant leadership,
Yeah,
no, that adds a whole different kind of like, as a leader, I really do owe something to the people who follow me.
exactly. What we hope to show you as we start to look at these, just these three definitions, is how different their approaches are with one another, how they're pulling out different sides of that facet of those diamonds that is leadership. And so when we get to the end of this webinar today, we're going to invite you to start crafting your own definition of leadership in your own sort of way that will be different from these and just as valid. And we want to make that point right here. Let me talk for a minute about the history of leadership, because when I did my doctoral work in leadership and organization development, I found this utterly fascinating, and I didn't actually expect this. That the first thing is that the idea of leadership is a very recent notion. Before around 1840, the end of the 19th century or so, leader was the king, the noble person, the Khan, the ruler. You know, they were born to leadership because they had a noble bloodline. Those were leaders. No one else in society were leaders or seen as leaders. The idea, even the very word, doesn't emerge until around the end of the 19th century. When it does, people start to think, let's study this. Let's start to figure this out. The goal was, if we could quantify this, put it in a paragraph, this is a leader, then we could reproduce more and more and more. Well, at first, in the end of the 19th century, between 1841 and 1904, was the great man era. And this is the modern era in terms of modernity, in terms of the worldview, modernity. And the idea was around, let's focus on the leader themselves. So the great man era, unfortunately, started this myth that leaders are born, not made. And unfortunately, that myth still persists today. We think, well, I'm not a leader. I'm not born to be a leader, or she was born to be a leader. She was definitely. That led into this period of traits. People started to go, well, let's think about this more deeply. Is there a set of traits that each person has? Like the ability to stand up in front of thousands of people and speak off the cuff, for example, or a kind of a charismatic personality. Maybe that's what makes a great leader. Then something happened in the middle of the 20th century. Henry Stodgel did the most exhaustive book, really, on leadership ever done, 1948. And this began a different shift altogether to focusing on leadership, what's happening in the process of leadership, not just on the leader themselves. And so a couple of periods came out of this after the 1948 paper. People looked at behaviors. What do leaders do? How do they behave? And then they started to look at contingency theory, which means in what setting are they a leader and what setting are they not? And even as you start to think about your own leadership, it's helpful to think about that from a perspective of, well, maybe in a group of 6 or 7, I can be a leader, but in a group of 50 or 100, I'm not. There are certain settings in which we feel more at home in our leadership than others. And that might help you define how you tend to lead. And that sort of was kind of the focus in that period. From 1980 and on was sort of this focus of this complexity era. This is a super complex, there's all kinds of dynamics, leadership and followership and servant leadership and all kinds of things people were thinking about in terms of leadership theory. From that point on the next slide, we'll find out some other interesting ideas have been the focus. Again, more on leadership. People started to focus on authentic leadership. I really like this era and these thinkings around how do I show up as a human being, as a leader? What do people sense that I'm authentic? I worked with a leader some years back who was leading his team, was new to the organization, was leading his team, and they were reading all the classic books on leadership, and he knew all the leadership theory, and yet his behavior was quite in contradistinction with that. He was coercing people, he was misbehaving, there was some malfeasance on his part, and he was fired for it. There was an incongruity between his behavior and his speech that people sensed, and that's why they didn't really want to follow him. Authentic leadership. Daniel Goleman, around the year 2000 or so, started talking about emotional intelligence, and his book Primal Leadership is one I'm reading at the moment. And he's talking about how leaders show up emotionally. What happens between the leader and the follower as the leader takes stock of what's happening emotionally in themselves first, and then in the group. Can the leader identify what I'm feeling, and can they identify what the people are in the room are feeling? And how do I intersect those kinds of things? One of the newest theories in leadership is called discursive leadership. And Peggy, you'll love this one because it goes right up your alley of communication. And it comes back to an earlier thought we had a minute ago. So discursive leadership, Gail Fairchild and others are talking about how does a leader use language to get people to understand the challenge we're trying to tackle. And the theory here is, what is the frame that the leader is using language to say, here's the challenge we have. So I think of a cinematographer. So if you've done any photography, you know that you can take your lens and you can zoom way out and see a panoramic view of the whole reality, or I can zoom way down in and just see a little bit. And the leader, when they use language, frames the problem or frames the issue for people to focus on. And this theory says that's the magic of leadership. What thoughts come to your mind, Peggy, as you hear these different eras of leadership and the history of this thought?
I mean, one thing that strikes me is there becomes more and more emphasis on, I like this idea of emotional intelligence, right? Being able to read the room, read other people, and take into account not only how your speech and how charismatic you are, but also take into account how other people are feeling and be able to respond to that emotion in a way that's really intelligent. And I think that really is a key of leadership that seems to be more and more emphasized.
Right. Yeah. On the next slide, we kind of list out some of the major facets of leadership. And this is what makes leadership so complex. But before we do that, I want to think about some of these myths that come out of this leadership theory of the history of leadership. First is this one, that leaders are born, not made. We know without a shadow of a doubt that this is not true. That there's no reality that's ever been proven in all the history of leadership theory and research. What we do know is that leaders can be developed. It's a complex process. It's not a simple process. You can't just send someone to training and go, I'll come back, I've taken leadership training. Even our webinar here is not sufficient to make you a leader. We at Turning West like to talk about the 2-3-4-1 kind of developmental model. We think of it's 2 parts instruction. This is instruction, this webinar is instruction about leadership. 3 parts coaching, having a coach work through elements of issues of leadership with you. 4 parts experience, your own practical experience of learning to lead in real time and in real life. And then 1 part reflecting on all that. So we know that leaders can be developed and you can grow your leadership. I just always want to cry when someone says to me, well, Dr. Goodwin, I'm not a leader. And I say, oh, yes, you are. We just need to uncover it for you. And that's the joy of what we're doing here, is we hope to really encourage you to see that you are a leader. We just want to help you find your style and your right environment for leadership.
Yeah. And, it strikes me that leadership is more than something on an org chart. And it really is, if you get back to those definitions, it really is about how you interact with people, how you motivate them, how you empower your friends and your colleagues. That is leadership as well.
how you live your life, how you live as an example, right? Because
Right.
most people sometimes will say to me, followed by, I'm not a leader. They'll say, well, I can't stand in front of people and speak, so I'm not a leader. This is another myth of leadership, that leadership has to be charismatic. And it's reinforced all the time by so much of people's experience of someone on the internet or on TV or a celebrity that we see. And we get this impression that you have to be charismatic, good looking, and well spoken to be a leader. And that is so not true at all. And all the research bears that out. And certainly our experience at Turning West bears that out. There's many, many ways to be a leader.
You
Or
know,
the
I
last one, yeah, please.
well, I think of an example of like who is the most exceptional leader that I know, and I was thinking about it at the university that I'm at, and the president is very outgoing and has that title. The provost is very sure of herself, and yeah, she makes decisions. She's good. The assistant provost she's very quiet, introverted. And when she first started, I thought, oh man, how is she going to lead this university?
Mhm.
And I'll tell you, every single time I get together with her, she listens to me. Like she sees me. And I'll tell you what, when she does make a decision, I know that she has heard me, and I will do almost anything that she asks me to do, because her leadership style is very different than the other kinds of leaders, but it is so powerful. And I think a lot of it, once again, has to do with some of that emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Um, and it really doesn't have to do with charisma and,
Right.
some of these other kinds of things.
And that goes to this last myth. You can't be shy and introverted and be a leader. That's absolutely not true. And you just told a great story illustrating that,
Yeah.
right? There's so many elements of leadership and so much here that it's skills. Certainly leaders have skills. Leaders also have to have being authentically who they are. It comes out of they're not faking it. They're walking their talk, as my old basketball coach used to say. They have vision, their behavior, if you want to keep advancing the animation there. Yeah. And, knowledge, they use language to lead. There's so many elements of leadership, and way more than I even have on this slide here. The emotional component, as you mentioned earlier, Peggy. This is why you need to find your own way of leading, because it's just as valid as everyone else's, but it's just as unique. Just like I have probably 800 books in my office here on leadership, all with a different definition. There's a reason for that. Is because we are as unique as individuals are unique. And so leadership is unique as every person themselves.
Yeah.
And so it begins with, yourself, knowing yourself.
And I do, the one of the things on here is influence. And there's quite a bit of study that's been done on how do you influence people? How do you persuade people in my discipline? And one of the things that I really appreciate is French and Raven's kind of basis of power or influence, because it's sort of like there's so many different ways to persuade people, influence, motivate, empower people. You might be like a super expert in your field and have like knowledge. I think I have expertise in communication and communication theories, right? Other people might have expertise in how to fix an RV, whatever. So we have expertise. We have some people have the kind of power that's like, I am the boss and I will tell you what to do. That kind of positional power. But then there's also this referent power, which is like, I want you to like me. And because you respect me, you'll do, you'll see things in a different way. So I think there's so many different ways to influence people that have very little to do with a lot of the things that we often associate with leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move now to, how do you figure out your own style? How do you develop your own leadership way of being? So a couple of key things for you to do, and this, we won't have time in this leadership webinar today, but something for you to do afterwards is to get a cup of coffee and sit down and think to yourself, what have been your biggest leadership successes? maybe leading a Boy Scout troop. Maybe it was leading the PTA at your children's school. Maybe it was something at work. And likewise, thinking about what have been your biggest failures, because these experiences will start to uncover for you and help you discern and figure out your own style as you think about these experiences you've had that have been places that you have been successful or not successful. Now, don't want you to go away thinking, well, I've had so many more failures than successes. That means I'm really not a leader. It simply might mean that I need to grow and work on some things here in this area. For example, my wife, I think, is a very, very capable leader, but she struggles with public speaking. And she's worked very hard on it. She's done a lot of Toastmasters programs and all kinds of things, but it's never going to be her strongest suit in leadership. But still, if you asked her team that she works with, they would tell you that she's a wonderful leader in so many other ways. So it's perfectly okay as a leader to have weaknesses and strengths. Peggy?
Well, I mean, one of my questions then is what have you learned about your leadership experiences by asking yourself these questions?
Yeah, I've learned, certainly my experience is I'm more of that upfront, charismatic leader.
Yeah.
And that's my style. But I also know that that has weaknesses and there's drawbacks to that. And I've learned about my style that because I can be so persuasive that sometimes I can carry people beyond their own motivation. And I've got to watch that
That's
carefully.
good.
And
That's
I have to be very careful about that weakness because it becomes my own self-deceptive place that I can move people beyond where they're comfortable because I can be so persuasive. And then as soon as I stop, then they lose motivation and they're really not with me after all. So I've learned some things about that, thinking about strengths and weaknesses and my failures and my successes that have really helped me shape my own style and know when to use it and when to back off.
Yeah. I know for me, some of the study abroad experiences, when I was leading study abroad trips, I found my successes were in establishing relationships. And by the end, it's like people trusted me because I paid attention to them. I saw them.
Right.
That's where my real influence was. And some of the failures, some of the contexts that I have found over time, I don't thrive in competitive environments. When there's competition for leadership, I don't really thrive in those kinds of situations. I tend to motivate people with my enthusiasm and my upbeatness, but what happens, like you said, like when you leave the room,
Right.
have I actually motivated them?
Absolutely. So one of the first places for you to begin is to think about values that are important to you. And we're going to kind of pop up on this animation a bunch of different values that are some common ones that come up. And as you start to think about what are the core values, your core professional values at the heart of who you are, you may choose achievement, collaboration, or excellence, or honesty, or justice. This is sort of important for you to grasp because this will come through time and time and time again as you experience your own leadership. Are you true to your values? And we like to suggest this place to begin because one of the first things the leader can do for their followers is to share their professional core values. So, for example, grace is my professional core value, my first one. And when I share that with people, they know that I'm looking for grace and I'm going to be giving grace. I like second chances and fresh starts for everybody is how I define that in my own professional experience. So when I share that, people know who I am and they know how to reach the core of who I am and the core of what I'm all about as a leader. This is a super really helpful place to begin. The second place we would start with this next slide is what's your approach to leadership? And this kind of wraps up some things we've talked about earlier is some people are able to lead from the front. I'm the person you could stand me up and say, go speak to 5,000 people off the cuff and I'd be fine. No problem whatsoever. That not everyone can do that, right? Some people need to, come from alongside, and this is a really valuable place to lead. You mentioned, that authenticness of your trips abroad with students, Peggy, right? that they've sensed you an authentic person, and you come alongside them, you listen to them, they got to know you, that's a place to lead there as well. Another place to lead is from behind. Real quick story. I had a secretary years ago who exemplified this. And Margaret, I was gone for a whole week, and I had a team retreat the next morning after I got back, and I wasn't prepared, and I was just going to wing it and off the cuff. And in walks Margaret, beginning of the meeting, 9 o'clock, and she's got a stack of collated papers, and she said to me, "Here's all the things you asked me to prepare for you for today." Wink, wink. And I hadn't asked her at all. She just knew. She was kind of the Radar O'Reilly of secretaries. She knew exactly what I was going to need before I needed it. And she was leading me from behind. And it was so incredibly important and valuable. And I lauded her for her leadership in that moment. She was shocked by that title. But I said, no, you lead from supporting others. And that's leadership too. A lot of people will find this the most surprising insight of this webinar, that's leadership, and that's valuable. And every leader up front will tell you, I've got lots of people behind who I depend on, who are leading me too. Any thoughts come to mind, Peggy, as you think about this?
I mean, I think that really exemplifies this metaphor of a servant leader, right? Someone who is role modeling what it means to be humble and helping other people and empowering other people. And that really doesn't happen from the front as much.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So we got a few minutes left. We want to help you kind of walk through some steps for how you would define your own leadership style. So the first one is, you need some time. You need some time for some self-reflection. And not just one time, but multiple times where you sit down and you put it aside and you come back to it. You had some more experience and you come back to it. And you start to identify, first of all, your 6 to 8 professional core values. This is super helpful, again, as we mentioned, to be able to share with others so they know who you are and what's most important to you. So share those with your colleagues. And then ask them and invite them to share with you how they see your leadership strengths and weaknesses, because they're going to see a perspective to you that you've not really taken into consideration before. So ask them in a gentle, confidential, safe way to share with you what they've experienced of you as a leader. How does this fit, Peggy? Yeah.
Well, I think this is such a good idea, because how often do we actually ask people for their assessment of us, unless it's like a 360 review or something. But sometimes it feels kind of weird, but I'll tell you what, people will tell you. You ask them, like, how do you see, what are some of my strengths and weaknesses as a leader? And you might actually get some information that you hadn't thought about. And it also opens up this lovely dialogue as well.
Right.
That you're seeking out some feedback.
Yes. When I was in college, when we were in college together, you and me, I ran for student body president. And I asked a friend of mine that I've known, went to high school with actually, and college, would she be my vice presidential candidate, my running mate? And without blinking, she said, absolutely no way, never. And I was shocked because we've been friends for years. And she gave me some really valuable help. She said, you intimidate me, Steve. And I didn't realize that how powerfully I was coming across to her. And she taught me such a valuable lesson that 40 some years later, I have never forgotten. That I've learned with certain contexts and certain people, I need to soften my approach, because I'm 6'7", I'm really large man, I have a deep baritone voice, I'm very self-confident, I can frighten people sometimes. And I learned something about my lesson, about my leadership, that I've never forgotten and I've carried with me all these years.
I'll tell you what, if you have adult children, you should ask your kids some of the feedback that they have, because I have learned a lot from my daughter, some of which I wasn't excited to hear, but
right. Yes,
they definitely know us.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you take all this, start to identify, at least in rough form, your preferred approach. I like leading from behind. I like leading from alongside. I like leading from up front. That will help you start to figure out what context and what environments you lead best in. And then test this over the coming weeks and months when you're at work, or you're work at the PTA, or you're involved in the Kiwanis Club or your religious organization. Offer to take on a role and see if you can test your leadership to grow it as well. And ask yourself, does this feel comfortable? Does it feel natural? Are there some skills I can learn here? Do I need to grow here in some areas? And then really ask this really key question: how are people responding to my approach? So leaders have followers, and followers are a key component to that leadership follower dynamic. And are they actually following you? Are they actually wanting to learn more from you, or emulate you, or walk in your footsteps? Now, this gets a little uncomfortable for people sometimes, thinking about, well, I'm not trying to be their guru or a cult leader or anything like that. No, that's not it at all. But do they want to follow you? Are they inspired by you? And that's an element of leadership.
And the thing I like about this is, I think it's really easy to be like, okay, I'm going to really work on my leadership skills. And you become someone that you're really not. You don't have to be a leader that's big. You don't have to do certain kinds of things. When you can figure out what really resonates with your style, with your personality, I think that's where the authenticity comes. And that's where authentic leadership is going to build trust with people. And that's where you're going to be most effective, which means you really do have to figure out, well, who am I? How do I work the best? And how can I take those strengths and use them in a lot of different kinds of contexts?
Absolutely. This is why it's so helpful to start to write down your preferred statement of leadership, right? And figure out what environments you lead in best and what you perform in worst. And and ask yourself, what does this teach you about your style? Maybe you're not that charismatic leader, but you're that leader who loves to support, or who has that gift of hospitality, who loves to just make things better for other people. That is leadership too, and so important. This other question of who follows me is really, really key. And why are they following? What do they want to do and be like? They want to be like you. They want to learn your skills. Do they want to learn how you listen to people? They want to learn how you tune in emotionally. They will tell you some things about your particular form of leadership that's so important.
Well, and even who doesn't follow me, like who is like pushing back, and why is that? Taking the time to actually stop and think about some of those questions.
Right. Then we come to capturing this in your preferred statement, your statement of your leadership style. I believe if you can name it, you can claim it. And what I mean by this psychological principle, if you can identify it and talk about it, you're more likely to live it out and repeat those behaviors that go with that. So test the statement out over against your actual performance over time. Invite your boss to help you test the statement out. And again, keep asking that feedback loop from others. How are you receiving my leadership? And when aren't you receiving my leadership? That I can learn to tune it a little bit or tune it down a little bit, as the case may be. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So above all else, if you hear nothing else from us, we want you to take away from this: you are a leader. Everyone is a leader in their own right, in their own context. There's no one right way to lead. There's no one characteristic, trait, quality, behavior, any of the above. You'll have your own unique style, just as unique as your own personality. And that's what makes the world such a joyful and wondrous place. Finding that is your job. Your job is to figure out who you are as a leader and how you show up, because that's your best chance to, as you said, Peggy, be a great parent, to lead in your family, to lead in your organization, to lead at your faith-based organization, to lead your friends. And we hope that you'll find this webinar really helpful, at least as the first steps to move forward in becoming a better leader and finding your unique style. It's been a real joy to have you join us today. Invite other friends to this webinar. You'll find it on our YouTube channel, Turning West, our Turning West channel on YouTube, or on our website, as well as on LinkedIn. If you have any more questions for Dr. Kendall or myself, you can reach us at these email addresses or on our website, turningwest.com. And there you'll find a number of other helpful webinars and topics and things for your resources. We can ever be of help to you and your organization. It's always our joy to do that.
And
Thank you very
I
much
do
for
have to
joining us.
say,
Yeah.
I do think that we do a lot of executive coaching or coaching, I should say. And a lot of this is like, I think about it in my head, but when I can actually talk with someone and get their feedback and get questions and think about it, that's when I really begin to focus in on things, specific steps that I can take to be more effective.
Great last thought. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you found this helpful. Go out and change the world. All right. Bye-bye.